So how have corporations gained such food power, and what's been the role of states? And in order to do this, I think we need to go back to the origins of the US empire after World War II, because it's a way to trace the way in which over the last 75 years, corporations have in fact come to occupy a global food system. I always like to point out that there's only one global food system, but there are many other food systems and food cultures, which Ana Maria has just talked about. So just with a brief overview, and I'm going to run through the decades pretty quickly up to the present day, from the origins of the US empire to the United Nations Food System Summit that just took place, which was a scandal. So after World War II, it's really important to see that geopolitics begin to organize the way in which food provisioning on a world scale operates. And this, in the long run, is at the expense of stable territorial-based food systems, such as they were. And one has to keep in mind that some of the post-colonial states had already had some of the parts of their agricultures reorganized to supply Europe in particular. So in the 1940s, of course, the United Nations articulated the ideal of the right to food, and food security is a human right. And that is still a principle, but it's been eroded very significantly in the last few years, as we know. So the first false solution, picking up on what Ana Maria was talking about, was the US food aid program after World War II, by which very quickly the US was disposing of food surpluses as aid to strategic third world states on the perimeter of the Cold War in order to help them industrialize with cheap food. The long-term plan was to move from aid to commercial imports to those countries from the United States and Europe as the bread baskets. In Korea, for example, the US introduced bread. Now Koreans know that, we all know that Koreans just love rice, but in fact the US was providing money to enable Korean housewives to learn to make bread and feed bread to their families. So that's the first part of the story. The second part is in the 60s and 70s, we saw Green Revolution technologies being introduced with public subsidy. So states are very much involved in this whole process. And here agro-technologies were replacing local farming systems. In the next decade, in the 1980s, there was a debt crisis, and the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, compelled third world states to undergo structural adjustment, and in particular, to encourage food exports to defray debt. So once again, corporations are getting in on the act via the public institutions and the states. In the 1990s, we saw NAFTA and the World Trade Organization liberalization versus national farm protection. So the whole idea was opening up the food trade and foreign investment in agro-exporting. The Director General of the WTO said, we're writing the constitution of a global economy. So states were now to serve markets, and comparative advantage was the new theme, if you like. And so agro-exporting became the sort of major way in which the food system was being restructured. Transnational corporations claimed that they could feed the world. And in the 1996 Food Summit in Rome, the food sovereignty movement emerged, contesting that claim, arguing that states were complicit in this process and needed to recognize their own sovereignty, and in turn to establish and promote food sovereignty on a democratic basis within society, so that territorial farm systems could be rebuilt. At the same time, some less developed countries were allowed some protections, but of course that's eroded over the last couple of decades. Initially, India was very defiant to protect its own domestic food stocks, but now we're seeing India opening up to corporate retailers like Walmart to come in and take over versus street markets and local groceries and millions of people who depend on wet markets, etc., across India. And secondly, we've seen Prime Minister Modi recently attempting to legislate corporate access to land and food for export, and of course precipitating an incredible farmers' rebellion that I think is very instructive for us all, because it's not just farmers who are rebelling, it's lawyers and chefs and social workers and doctors and truckers and other workers who are building this incredible alliance to support the farmers. And I think that we'll see more of this in the future. The 21st century was the financialization era. And this is when land becomes a financial asset. So not just corporations, but also equity companies, pension companies are investing in land that they have no business investing in. They know nothing about farming. And this is happening on a world scale. The Brazilians know this very well. And at the same time, we're seeing the reduction of food to fungible commodities. So the substitution of vegetable oils for butter as an industrial process allows corporates and financiers to get involved in reorganizing the food system. Ana Maria mentioned this also. So we now see sugars, oils, grains as inputs for durable foods, not as foods in and of themselves. And this, of course, promotes endless processing of foodstuffs via a financial logic. The next part of the 21st century is the public-private partnership idea, which the UN promoted in the year 2000 with the UN Social Compact, when the UN was attempting to encourage corporations to adopt social responsibilities. Of course, that hasn't happened, but anyway, AGRA, the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, which was funded by the Gates Foundation in 2006, was the exemplar of this public-private partnership, whereby states would provide credit to enable philanthropy and private capital to come in and establish agro-input systems to encourage farmers to purchase commercial seeds and inputs that they would need, such as chemicals, fertilizers, etc., to grow their food. Two other examples of the public-private partnership were the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition in Africa, where the G7 encouraged private corporations to come into about 10 African countries and establish corridors of industrial food for export. So that was another example. And that public-private partnership has moved all the way up to the present day, with people arguing that the United Nations has now become a public-private partnership. In 2008, after the food crisis in 2008, there was a food summit in Rome where value chain agriculture was encouraged, again, encouraging corporations and financiers to invest in industrial agriculture at the level of small farming systems. And of course, what happens there is that insofar as those farmers are surrendering their own knowledge of landscapes to industrial inputs, they're becoming simply laborers on their own land, producing food not for their neighbors and citizens, but for foreign consumers. Right up to the present day, we have the 2020 World Economic Forum establishing this devil's bargain with the United Nations, which was an incredible thing that happened. And of course, Klaus Schwab, who was the original founding chair of the World Economic Forum, which represents the 1,000 largest multinationals in the world, arguing that multilateralism was dead. And the reason why he's arguing that was because of the austerity protests and food riots that were cascading across the world from the 2008 food crisis through the financial crisis in around the same time. And we saw the Arab Spring and various other incredible protests that were going on. And what Klaus Schwab was doing was recognizing that these protests were contesting or threatening the legitimacy of the large agribusiness corporations and financiers. And this is very much part of the idea of the shock doctrine that Naomi Klein coined, the idea that when things get pretty bad, the possibility for some organic progressive policy is right there. And so corporations step in and attempt to stem the tide by pushing governments to take countermeasures. And what I'm getting at here is that the World Economic Forum successfully managed to get the whole Hmm? Okay, thank you. The World Economic Forum managed to get the United Nations, which represents all of the states, not just one state. So this is the culmination of the shock doctrine on a global scale, to attempt to blunt the the protests, the food sovereignty movements, all of the rebellions that we've been talking about, and the counter movements that are still building across the world, and in fact showed their power, I think, over the last year with their resistance to the Food Systems Summit. But what's really interesting is about that summit, and Anna Maria mentioned this too, that Farmer Voice and the CFS were marginalized initially. They weren't taken seriously at all until widespread protests. Even so, I think that the Food Systems Summit really is a smokescreen for what's going on behind the scenes, and that is attempting to build the legitimacy and capacity for the corporate sector to become the governors of the global food system. And just on that point, I'd argue that, I'd point out that food corporations actually now command billions more in infrastructure across the world beyond the multi-billion-dollar markets for their goods, including $540 billion annually in global subsidies from governments and international financial institutions that are on track to soar to $1.8 trillion, 1.3 trillion pounds a year by 2030. So ultimately, this kind of infrastructure has the capacity to lock in these governing structures. And so we have a big task ahead of us. Nevertheless, I think the legitimacy of corporate industrial agriculture, now biodigital agriculture, where Google and various other digital companies are now beginning to take agriculture over. These are going to be issues that we're going to be fighting for some time. La Via Campesina talked about industrial agriculture as agriculture without farmers. And what I'm suggesting with the biodigital takeover is we're going to see agriculture without humans, where decisions are made from the safety and comfort of urban offices, far away from the fields where crops are being grown. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much, Isa.